Okay, good afternoon once again. Today I'm going to share with you a lecture on software management. Now this time the lecture will talk about dealing with a large network. So this is lecture 6 after looking at lecture 5, the one that we considered last time. Now this time we want to look at how we can deal with large networks on the computer. Because the purpose of having this lecture is to help the users to appreciate the fact that as you use the computer, network diagrams can become so big and that can affect the analysis and the viewing of the same network diagram using the computer. So expect to have problems as we deal with networks that are very big, more especially with networks that spans for a long time and that handles so many sub-projects within itself. So network diagrams sometimes can present special difficulties that will be looked at in this lecture 6. So now when a project is of a long duration, as I mentioned, some activities extend into the distant future. It is not always possible to predict the course of events with enough accuracy to allow detailed planning right through the final activity. So as Ada mentioned, you find that if networks are so big and they span into the distant future, we expect that they become so big on the screen, which means this affects the analysis of the diagram. As we are trying to examine it on the screen is very small. So keep on scrolling forward, backwards, and that can affect your examination of the network diagram. Yet a network plan must be made with a continuous path to the end of the project if time analysis is to be driven correctly by the target complete date. So what does this point mean? It means that if, for example, you're trying to examine the network diagram on the screen, you must be able to see a full diagram on the screen so that you can be able to examine it from the start up to the end without difficulties. But if part of the diagram is not seen, you find that as you scroll forward to see what is going to be the data on the next page, you find that you forget the data from the previous page. In this way, analysis becomes so difficult. So the size of networks that can be viewed sensibly on the computer screen is very limited. Though there might be no problem in entering thousands of activities into the project file, viewing them in another issue. That's very true. But remember, if you keep on scrolling, you forget what you saw. In that way, you're going to have difficulties examining the data as you try to practice the information. So it is not possible to follow the logic of a network diagram reasonably well if it has to be scrolled up, down, sideways across many pages on the small screen, as Ada mentioned. So now, what is the solution to this problem? The solution is we need to apply the principles of rolling waves. Rolling waves basically is one of the methods that is used to deal with the problem of planning projects that stretch into the distant future as being called rolling wave planning. Basically, the concept of wave, as we know it, it's a disturbance rather. So if you actually apply the force on a particular area, you find that the waves on that source will be very close to each other. As you move away from the source, you find that the waves are big. The range of the wave are also very big. So the concept here is, if you are trying to focus on the problem at hand, what is important on the diagram at hand, you must be able to concentrate or focus on the activities that are important at that particular moment. In that way, you will be able to examine the data which is important currently as you move towards the other elements of the network diagram that are also important later on. So the planner compiles the project network with as much details as possible, given the information available at the start of the project. Yes. So, therefore, there is adequate detail for the first few months of work. Beyond a certain time, the information presented to the planner might be vague or non-existent, which is very, very correct, as Ada mentioned. So I find that the most important information on the network diagram will be focused on the screen to begin with. As you move towards other elements that are also very important in the project, then you keep on focusing them on the screen as you move on, just like that. Hence, applying the principles of roaring waves as you examine the network diagram. So activities towards the end of the project might have to be shown on the network as representing largely items or also relative items of the work. So perhaps even with a single activity representing the whole work package. By the way, the work package is a piece of work that is accomplished in the project. So the network for a project lasting many years could contain many small activities and detailed logic near project start. But with a level of detail having to decrease as the plan moves into the future, you find that even the analysis in that way becomes easy because you focus on what is more important currently. As you move, other activities also become so important. So you might examine the entire project without difficulties. So the later stages would show relatively few, but corresponding larger activities as the final completion activity is approached. So this is the diagram that we are talking about, people. So as you can see from the source, this is a source of disturbance. So find that there will be so many waves which will be very close to each other and perhaps very big. As you move in the distant future, they'll be large, okay, separated from each other and become smaller and smaller. So now, what is the principle here? The principle is you focus on the most important item at a time. Then you keep on moving towards the other item that will be important later on. So eventually you find that you eventually consider the whole network diagram without having so many difficulties of analysis and accuracy. So this method of roaring waves help the planners to examine a bigger network on the screen without difficulties. So when the time arrives for each network update, the planner needs to review the information available on later activities and, if possible, introduce more details into those stages of the network. Hence, the picture images of the planner gradually pushing the levels of details in the network forward, like roaring wave, as work on the project progresses, as illustrated in the figure, this figure here. Okay, so now this is one of the techniques that can be used to solve the problems of working with a bigger network on the screen. What other technique? Our technique is called hierarchical network breakdown. Yes, it is possible to avoid networks having thousands of activities while still planning in sufficient depth of detail. So by breaking the main network diagram into a series of sub-networks, we are going to achieve the purpose of alleviating what? The difficulties that we have when working with a big network. So the principle behind here is to break down a bigger network into smaller sub-networks which can be handled or examined individually. So this is usually done by attempting to start from the work breakdown structure of the project. Each work package can be planned separately with its own relatively small network diagram. This way, you find that you'll be able to examine all those work packages successfully. So in summary, okay, if you look at the summary network, it is necessary that interface with all the sub-networks and makes a coherent time analysis possible. So the figure below illustrates this approach. What is this figure? This one here. We can see on top there's a summary network which is divided into these sub-networks which are magnified here. So when you divide the network in this manner, you'll be able to examine these individual sub-networks which can fit on the computer screen without difficulties. Remember, the objective is to have a full network on the screen as opposed to having half or 3/4 of it or a quarter of it on the screen as we examine the network diagram. Remember the reasons behind that? If it is like that, you're going to have difficulties of accuracy and also consistency. Okay, so now, what you've just looked at from the beginning up to this point is we have established a problem which is there as you work with a big network. And also, we have looked at methods that can help us to reduce the problems that you have earlier alluded to. That is the rolling wave planning, which helps us to consider the bigger network, okay, gradually as we progress with other activities on the network diagram. And also, we have seen another successful method of dealing with a big network is called hierarchical network breakdown. So this one helps us to divide and conquer, divide a bigger network into smaller components which can be used to examine and analyze a bigger network so that we can have accurate information for our planning and decision making. So now, let's look at the approaches that we can use if we're working with a bigger network. Other people, they prefer a centralized system, or others, they prefer a distributed system of doing things. So if you're working with a bigger network, perhaps having so many projects in it, you might be able to decentralize the project, meaning you might be able to assign people or some subgroups with their sub-project managers to manage those sub-activities in various places. And then eventually, there must be a reporting system where all these sub-managers should be able to report back the results of what is happening in those individual branches. Or perhaps you might say, let's have one area where everything will be done and managed from. That is centralized approach. So these two approaches are all successful. They've got advantages and disadvantages. So it's up to the project manager to decide which of the two approaches can be used. Remember, at one time, this approach of centralized was actually the only possibility of doing the project, which are very big. But as time goes on, many people prefer to have data put on different computers so that they can be reported back individually from various centers. As I said earlier on, it's up to the project manager or the sponsors or the team to decide how they're going to handle this. All these techniques can provide you with the success in terms of project execution. So other project applications, they also allow these approaches to be done. You can be able to share the application by using the centralized process, or you can also distribute the files so that they can be updated individually from different applications. Also, Microsoft Project, yes, can allow these two approaches to be done without difficulties. So you study the advantages of centralized approach, and also you study the advantages of distributed approach. In this way, you'll be able to make the right decision whether to go for centralized approach or distributed approach. Now, perhaps I would like to give you this assignment to consider. As you study, okay, as you listen to this lecture, I want you also in your own time to find out the advantages of having a centralized approach in project management and the disadvantages of a centralized approach. Also, we can also look at advantages of distributed approach and also disadvantages of distributed approach. If you look at these, you examine these advantages, therefore, you will understand the reason why I'm saying the choice is actually dependent on the manager and the team according to which of the two will benefit the most. Okay. Now let's look at the standard networks. Standard networks. Remember, as we mentioned from the start, that network diagrams becomes difficult. They only become difficult if we are doing them for the first time. What does that mean? It means that when I do them for the first time, everything you do them from scratch. But as time goes on, you find that you'll be dealing with similar projects, of course with some few adjustments. But since you have done these networks several times for so many different projects, you'll be able to just make changes to those previous projects to suit the current projects. And this is what you are calling the concept of standard library networks. So you must be able to keep a record of previous drawings, because in this way, you will discover that the subsequent projects that you're going to do, you do them with ease and very fast, because if you're not doing everything from scratch, instead you do things just by modifying things here and there, and able to achieve what you want. So standard networks can sometimes prove to be such time saver, as I mentioned, that they will be used when the networking process might otherwise have been ignored or failed. So of course, standardization technique cannot be applied to all projects. But failing even to consider they might deny the organization substantial cost and time benefit, as Ed mentioned. Therefore, standard networks in practice, what is this point? We are saying it is easiest type of standard network that is employed by many organizations to do their work effectively without so many difficulties. So this condition is quite rare in real life, but there are many cases where standard master network can be devised or developed that will at least act as a general pattern for planning similar projects. So as you have projects which have done and have kept the file of these things very well, later on people will discover that you'll be just making few modifications to do the projects later on. It is very, very good, people, because you must endeavor to work smart as opposed to always working very hard in life. Right. So the technique is carried out by first drawing a master network covering all activities required for the project, which is judged to be typical of the range of projects carried out in the organization. Yes, many companies sell projects that can be designed and built with a range of options. In these cases, the standard network should be drawn to include all the options, at least most of the common options. For example, the network is produced for a range of houses to be built with or without a garage. The standard version should include a garage. So that if you don't want to include the garage, just remove that part that you don't want. If there will be a need of including a garage, then take the whole standard network the way it is and adopt it as a new project plan. Have you seen the beauty of having such network diagrams which are kept for future reference? These are the benefits. You save time and also cost. So people, it is a simple matter to strike out the activity not needed for house product and routing. Now in doing things from scratch. So if you have a well, incorporating plan, you find that you just knocking out things that you don't want, deleting things that you don't want, leaving things that you want, and if you are lucky, you might find that everything is needed, just adopt the right kinds of plan. Okay? So, reviews. Okay, the standard estimate duration, resource, and cost data for all activities according to the complexity of the work that you have. So the modified or edited standard network is then taken as a network plan, as Ella mentioned, and use it to plan the current project, which you also keep. And later on in future, since we're in this business, you might reuse the same plan. So people never discard the previous projects, because you never know when those things will save you money and also time. So people, don't forget. Always keep the record of what you've done. In future, it will save time and also cost, which will be many benefit of doing the project to speak. Okay, very well then, people. This is how far we can go. I encourage you also to anticipate another lecture. Of course, the lectures after this, lecture 6, they will be focusing on the practical aspect of project software and Microsoft product. Thanks very much.